Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Fireside Chat with Rich and Matt, Sapiens 3, presented by NatHab Expedition Leaders Richard de Gavea and Matt Meyer. Thank you so much for being here today, gentlemen. Richard, I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thanks, Kendall, and thanks, NatHab, for having us again. Today, we are going into the third section of our Sapiens talk, and we're going to go into the Industrial Revolution and looking forward. As we've moved through things, and Matt will do a recap in a second, we've really done gone through depth of where we've come from. And today we've decided not to put funny photos, but show ourselves being the green ambassadors that we are. And I'm busy walking here with a whole bunch of porters in Rwanda heading up to the gorillas. And I've been guiding for NatHab, for those of you who haven't seen any of our talks, for the last 6 years, doing trips all over Africa. So I'm going to hand over to Matt and we'll get this started.
Thanks, Rich, and thanks, Kendall, and thanks, NatHab, for having us once again. Yeah, that's me with a Rhino, or my wife and I, at a Rhino sanctuary in South Africa doing some conservation work, which actually we met through. So yeah, you can see a couple of little rhinos there in the background, and that was a couple of years ago, just after we'd met. But so, as Rich was saying, Sapiens. So this book inspired us, got us to thinking about this whole construct of us as a species, what we've done to this point, and now what we're going to be looking at into the future. And so I'm just going to reread over what we did in the very first one to give a bit of pretext to today's topic. So the timeline of history, going all the way down to basically 500,000 or 2 million years ago, humans spread from Africa to Eurasia, evolution of different human species. The Neanderthals evolved in Europe and the Middle East at 500,000 years, 300,000 years, the daily use of fire, 200,000 years, Homo sapiens evolved in East Africa. 70,000 years ago, the cognitive evolution, emergence of fictive language, the beginning of history, and sapiens spread out of Africa. 45,000 years ago, sapiens settled in Australia, extinction of Australian megafauna. 30,000 years ago, extinction of the Neanderthals. 16,000 years ago, sapiens settle America, extinction of American megafauna. 13,000 years ago, the extinction of Homo floresiensis, Homo sapiens, the only surviving human species. 12,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, permanent settlements. Now that was our second fireside chat on sapiens, and that one we dug very deep into us becoming a more sedentary rather than a hunter-gatherer species that we were up until that point. Now we move into 5,000 years ago, the first kingdoms, scripts, and money. 4,000 odd years ago, the first empire. 2,500 years ago, the invention of coinage, so universal money, and the Persian Empire, Buddhism in India. 2,000 years ago, the Han Empire in China, Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, and Christianity. 1,400 years ago, Islam. 500 years ago, the scientific revolution. Humankind admits its ignorance and begins to acquire unprecedented power. Then Europeans begin to conquer America and the oceans. And that is where we'll start today, that transition into the Industrial Revolution and into the present and the future, where I'm going to hand back over to Rich.
Cool. So, guys, we're going to talk about colonialization and the impact it's had on the planet. I think where we've gone so far, we've discussed a lot about how we as humans have evolved, changed, and become something greater than most other animals have, just in terms of our ability to change and use our environment and how the environment changed us. Now, as things got bigger, empires got bigger, countries started forming, things started happening, we started utilizing a lot of resources. So I've taken an image of Europe from 1000 BC up at the top here, where you can see how green and forested the place was. And as we move through from 300 BC to 8350 to 1000 years ago to 500 years ago to 250 years ago, you can see how the forests were depleted. In the last one, we spoke about charcoal being a big source, and wood and lumber have always been a big thing, plus making space for agriculture. So there's this push and pull that's happening. Now, ultimately, colonialization or colonization in any way, shape, or form was the European nations, what they decided to do was go out and explore. Now, at this time, there was no difference between the technological advancements of Europe, India, and China, who were basically the biggest areas, and Saudi Arabia, that sort of section. The only difference was this idea of let's go see what else is out there. So it was this exploration thing. And as they moved out, they started conquering under their flags. And as this happened, there was this new amount of resources that were available to them. So the ultimate goal at the end was then to enrich the empire, both in trade and resources. And this was accomplished through natural resource extraction and cash crops. So, and it was done with very little thinking of the environment. Already we can see through this image just how little thought of the environment there was. And the economic pressure and upkeep of these colonies also played a major role in the environmental damages that resulted from this. So I'm going to start by showing you a map of how Africa was split up. So the Europeans came down, moved into Africa, and then started carving it up into little pieces and saying, we're going to take this and we're going to take this. And so it went. And one of the things that happened out in South America around the Andes in Bolivia, the Spanish were after a lot of silver. They were going through a wartime period between the 15th and the 17th century. And the crown was dependent on this silver. So what they did was they went through this idea of trying to get as much silver as possible without any thought of consequence for human or environmental factors. To do this, they required three things: labor, lumber, and mercury. And what I'm going to try and explain to you is how just thought of resource extraction has such a far-reaching environmental thing. If you hear rumbling around me, it's because we're having a beautiful thunderstorm here in Johannesburg. So effectively what happened was they started mining these areas, but because of the layout of the land, there weren't a lot of people around, and they needed more production. As the production went across, so they needed more. So they needed more labor. They started bringing in slaves. The slaves then needed more space. The operation required all this lumber, one for wood to be able to smelt this silver out of the rock. So they started deforesting. And so this area started opening up, and then they used the mercury to separate everything and get the silver out. So there was this start of this whole thing. But as it got bigger, the ecological overdraft that depleted the natural resources was so great that it couldn't keep up with current demand, let alone the extra demand that was now being put on them. So this cost feedback, this positive feedback loop just kept on going and going and going and getting more and more and more expensive. So the way to explain it, this is from a mine called Potosi, which was one of the best known ones. In the mid 1700s, its population around there was 160,000 people. That's as big, or if not bigger, than a lot of the European cities at that stage. Timber was brought in from hundreds of miles away, some of it from as far as Paraguay, modern day Paraguay. Timber had to be, this led to a 200,000 square mile commodity frontier, which had to be expanded to meet the demands. The mercury that was being used was poisoning people. It led to death and maiming and poisoning of 2/3 of the workforce. This depleted the dependent or the lifespan of these guys, which means you needed more workers. So slaves had to be brought in from Africa to deal with this. And the mercury then, as everything got deforested, any mercury that was deposited into the soils was then washed off and run off, and all then went out into the Amazon basin. So you can actually see the river analysis of how far the red areas are the very bad areas, but just how far down all of this mercury made its way through the Amazon basin because of this mining. So that's one old example, but there's a newer one, and it's the desiccation of a inland sea called the Aral Sea. It's located within the Soviet Union, and it's an ecological disaster on an unprecedented scale. After World War II, basically the European powers were losing their power of their colonies. It became too expensive to run them. There was also a little bit of feedback that there could be problems if they kept on going, so they had to release them. And one of the biggest territories that was lost was by Great Britain, and that was India. And cotton production was slowed, and that decentralization of it meant the Soviet Union decided they were going to get involved. They really wanted to try and take a market share and get in there. So what they started to do was dig these channels away from the two main rivers that fed this Aral Sea. And they were very ineffective. There was a lot of evaporational loss. There was a lot of absorption into the ground, and very little was thought about the impact that this would have on the Aral Sea. This led to the shrinking of the sea. Here you can see a picture of how much this has disappeared. And the knock-on effects were crazy, because as it sank, the sea became hypersaline. So the salt content started going up. And this resulted in the Aral Kum Desert. This area just on the side here is called the Aral Kum Desert. And what happened was, as this dried up, the fishing villages became a problem. There was also now a decade of runoff from the pesticides and insecticides that were used and fertilizers into this area, which made a toxic layer that made it infertile to any agriculture or livestock farming. The hypersalinity of the water started to kill the fish. From 1960 to 1980, 50% of the fish in that area died, and in the next 20 years, the rest did. So it's now zero fish in that whole place. Now there were toxic dust storms sending sand with toxic dust into the next river deltas. They were carrying between 15 and 17 million tons of this toxic gas between 2000 and 2009, and have led to the dramatic increase in tuberculosis and other upper respiratory diseases. So all these great ideas to try and take charge of something, and I'm talking just 2 projects, but you can imagine, you looked at that map of Africa, just how much space had been taken up by other countries just for natural resources. It had a huge impact on our environment, and we're still now trying to cope with those things. So I'm going to hand over to Matt, and he's going to start talking a little bit later into the westernization of things.
So you've got one or two of those examples that Richard was just talking about. So when they were mining silver in sort of West South America, they were going for a very specific, very small mineral and a precious metal, for that. And so they go in, they use all of these resources to get one small thing. And if you think about it, we've got a modern equivalent right here. We've got precious metals from around the world that sit in our pocket every day, and it's technology that we used to, but it's something that we don't think of. And the reason we don't think of it is because of this concept and this idea of being westernized. So westernized is the adaptation of culture, religions, etc., from Western Europe, essentially. The diets, the houses, the lifestyle, just everyday lives. We instead of moving and living in these sort of small communities, everyone, and you've got this one, everyone lives around in the country. You've got everyone wanting to conglomerate into these big areas of cities. So the two sort of most well-known cities that started this trend will be London and New York. They're right at the base of, or right on riverbed or on rivers, so transportational highways. And people would conglomerate there and live in unnaturally dense environments. So people are not, as a species, we're not meant to live in that density. And if you don't live there, then you want to live in this massive big house. So if you were to go, when we were talking about on our last webinar about how Homo sapiens lived, we were hunter-gatherers. We'd move around. We'd have these little informal settlements. We'd use whatever was in our immediate area, in our immediate environment, build a shelter, use the resources around us until they were exhausted to the point where the cost to energy ratio was exhausted, and then we would move on. So when the water was too saline to drink, we wouldn't have any water there. When we had hunted the majority of the animals that only the fast ones were around and they were running away from us, we would then go to the next place and move on and move on. But now we decide, no, we want this one big house and we want to bring everything to us. And the only way to do that is to then exploit other environments that might not necessarily be directly linked to us. And just like when they were clearing the forests to use to smelt the silver, they started slowly a trend clearing the Amazon rainforest. And now that has shifted. As our population has grown, so we have needed more and more resources. As our economies have increased and people have gotten wealthier in a lot of the Western world, our ability to import, export, do all of those things has increased exponentially. And so, I mean, this is an example of how this pristine environment that is capable of sustaining life of thousands, tens of thousands of species is now cleared to make way for one thing, for cattle. Almost the entire, I think it's about 60% of the Amazon that's been cleared has been cleared for the production of cattle. And that has only increased because of our Western diet and our Western ways of thinking. If you were to go to some of those tribes we were talking about in our last webinar, where how much of their diet is made up by meat, it's less than 10%. Now, if you look at it, how much of our diet is made up of meat, it's substantially higher. If you look at the amount of livestock that's been produced over the last 60 or 70 years and how it's grown, but it's grown in those countries that are now adopting a Western diet. And if you look at the population growth, that is just, it's growing. I mean, Asia is growing exponentially. And so along with their population, their diet has grown. And an interesting figure, if you look at that, if we were to harvest us as a species at the same rate that we are harvesting all of those animals on that chart, so basically livestock, us as a species sitting at now, we're at 7.7 billion individuals on this planet, we would last a grand total of just shy of 3 weeks. That's how many animals we need to utilize to sustain us right now. And yes, there's obviously a huge number of waste and excess in that, but that has only been made easier by you work 12 hours a day to get your money, to have that big house, to live in the city, and then on your way home you go through a drive-through and you get your bag of whatever it is, one of those very well-known, well-branded Western diets on your way home to then sit and do nothing and be sedentary. We're not, as a species, we're not meant to do that. We're not evolved to do that. And both, I mean, you're watching us from the comfort of your homes and we're sitting in homes. We're all guilty of it. It's not a finger pointing thing. It's one of those, as a species, there are so many things that we need to get right that we have wronged over the last 510,000 years that we're now sitting at because of our population, because of our lack of sustainability. We now need to look into the future and to see what we've done right up until this point and what we can do right into the future. And so we're going to talk about just a few sort of conservation success stories that have allowed us to preserve the small pieces of the wild areas that we still have left, and how those can be used as a model and our ability to project into the future.
So I want to go back on that, because I think what Matt so eloquently put across is our sedentary nature has led to a lot of things. And what I was explaining with colonization is how we wiped out a lot of spaces in order to do it. Hunter-gatherers used to go, okay, the water's not good here, we move to the next spot. But it was never to the point that they couldn't come back to that point. Where
Exactly.
The way we're moving along right now is we use up a spot and then walk away from it and nothing else happens. So what we're going to look at are a couple of the things, because we've suddenly got to the stage where we went, oh crap, we actually need to do something about this.
Yeah.
So there have been a few really good examples, and one is obviously the bald eagle, America's national symbol since 1782. I mean, it's been around for ages, but it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that it became an emblem for the environmental movement, as the numbers plummeted because of the effects of DDT. And DDT was a synthetic insecticide pesticide that was created in the 1940s and was used over crops. And as it washed down through the rivers, it got into the fish and the bald eagles were eating them. This egg over here is showing signs of DDT. And what the DDT did was it actually softened the shells, and it led to huge numbers of nest failures. Now, a nest failure is where both the chicks die and that family doesn't then breed. So it's not so much that they're being lost, but their numbers aren't coming up. So there's no replacement of those that are being lost. So the numbers dropped so low that in 1963, there were 417 breeding pairs left in the lower 48 states. In Alaska, there was no issue because there wasn't any massive use of DDT up there, so it didn't impact those birds. But in the lower 48, only 417 breeding pairs. DDT was then banned, and the species was fully protected under the fledgling Environmental Species Act of 1973. By 1997, that act, that whole piece of legislation, the act of not hunting them, not looking, getting nests, not getting any eggs or keeping any eggs, and obviously the non-use of DDT anymore, by 1997, there were 5,000 breeding pairs. By 2007, they were removed from the Federal Endangered Species list altogether. And the last count in 2009 was an estimated 72,000 birds. So these great numbers of these birds coming back. So by doing this, what we've done is we've started looking at our faults and seeing our faults. But unfortunately, we can only see them right at the end, and we're having to get so close to the end before we start pulling them back. And Matt's going to talk about another success story or another story. So hit it.
Right around the time of when we were seafaring Westerners going from Europe to North America and down, we discovered this huge creature that we could harvest. We get oils, we make soaps, perfumes, there was meat, they used the bones, they used a lot of things from the whales. But in the short span of only a couple of decades, we took the species that were basically in the Atlantic and the Pacific and reduced them by about 90%. So you were looking at sort of 500,000 or 600,000 estimated whales around at the turn of the 19th century, where in 1986, when they went, ooh, what have we done? We'd lost 90% of that. And so 1986, the global conservation community put in place an act and developed an organization to protect whales. Now, obviously, we all know there are a few countries in the world that still don't, practice that, and they do practice whaling. But since that Protection Act was put in place, a lot of the, well, not a lot, a few of the whale numbers have started to increase. But that's an example of an animal that now we were able to bring it back from the brink of extinction to a point where it wasn't us killing them directly. We weren't going out and actively hunting whales, and we haven't been so for 35 years. But now the thing that's affecting them is our global climate. So, and what we're doing as a species. So the exploitation of these giant fisheries, so all of these giant fishing lanes that have been now exploited by large scale net liners coming in with bycatch for days, that's taking away the food for a lot of these whales. But then the fluctuating and rising sea temperatures as well, that affects their food sources. So this was a group of animals. I'm talking three main species in particular, the southern right, the blue, and the humpback. We were able to bring back from near extinction to then slowly starting to increase their numbers. So we were successful in doing that. But then as the byproduct of our environment and what we're doing globally, they are now starting to, they've reached as good as they're going to get. And now because there's not enough food and their environmental temperature is being affected, they're starting to slowly drop off again. And we're finding whales. There was a whale washed off the coast of South Africa. There are whales off the coast of North and South America that are just popping up. And it's, what's the explanation? They're full of plastic, or they're being caught in fishing nets. And so this is one of those stories that we were successful to a point, and now we need to reevaluate. And arguably one of the greatest success stories that we haven't had to reevaluate very much is what Rich is going to talk about now. And we're both fortunate enough that we have been able to experience these animals in the wild and see this firsthand as to how conservation tourism has benefited a species and literally brought it back from almost the point of no return.
And thanks, Matt. I think the biggest thing to realize is colonization, and us as a species, money became a part of it. When Matt started the whole thing, he was talking about the invention of the coin, the invention of money, and we all trust money. Where the problem came in is that environment equaled money. Environment didn't have a value of its own. And now with it, the only way that they got the value was by removing that environment. So one of the biggest things with the mountain gorillas, and these guys are spectacular. I had the privilege of visiting them 52 times. And I hope very soon, once all of this craziness is over, to be getting back to my cousins up there in the mountains. But basically, when Diane Fossey started doing her research up in the mountains, the numbers down there had dropped as low as 220 individuals. That is an incredibly low amount. They are split between two countries, Rwanda and Uganda, in two different parks. Uganda's one is Windy Impenetrable National Park, which is such a cool forest to go into. And here's a picture of us walking through the impenetrable forest. That was on one of the elephant pathways, but it does get a lot thicker than that. And as these numbers drop, what happened was there was a lot of habitat loss. Here we can see again all of the habitat loss and the edge of the forest that's coming along. So what happened was people started removing things. One, the British that were in the area started opening areas up for tea plantations. So remove forest and get that going. Plus, population growth was on the go. So people needed to grow their own food. So agriculture becomes a big thing. And the forest stands in the way. You need the wood to make your houses, and their primary form of cooking is on charcoal. So how do you get charcoal? You chop down trees, you then bury it and put stuff on, and you have an anaerobic fire, a fire without oxygen that then burns this and creates a charcoal. And charcoal making is a major industry because it brings in multi-billion-dollar industry within these areas because of the usage that people get out of it. So suddenly you have this charcoal making, you've got habitat loss, you have diseases. In Congo, we've had Ebola outbreaks, and Ebola's, because of the nature of these guys, they are, if we compare a human and a gorilla's DNA sequence, they only differ from us by 1.6%. It is a tiny, tiny amount. So they are just as afflicted by our diseases as we are. And Ebola has wiped out a lot of lowland gorillas. There was a population of 5,000 lowland gorillas that were wiped out just by Ebola. But then the biggest thing was our domination of the world. We now in our sedentary lifestyles decided that we wanted to see animals, but from the comfort of our home cities without having to travel to these impenetrable forests and to volcanoes to be able to see them. So people were trying to get the babies. And in order to get the babies, they would have to go through the entire family. This is a silverback. Silverback weighs between 300 and 400 pounds, stands at about 5'11" to 6 foot, with the biggest ones tipping the scales at about 510 pounds. Now he's a big protector. He will look after his babies all the way through. But unfortunately, we had superior weapons. So what people would do would come in and they would kill the entire family for one baby. And a baby would fetch between $1,000 and $5,000 on the market. And this was a big thing. Plus it was poaching. Poaching gets in for bushmeat, they were eating the things, and secondly, poaching for other antelope and buffalo and elephant that were inside there. They would set up snares and the gorillas would get caught in these things. So how did conservation tourism change this? Suddenly we put a value on an animal, and not only on the animal, but on the area. And since that number of 220, the last count, which was this year, the beginning of this year, they finalized it, was 1,063 individuals. So a great turnaround in their numbers. They are reveling in the change and in the happiness that comes along. They've also found that tourism has had a positive impact on the groups just because of the fact that they have a better survival because they have protection, because there are armed guards with them. They have regular monitoring, so if any one of them is ill, they get better veterinary care. And this is a major bonus. You know, we don't want to impact or inflict too much impact on them, but we're having a positive impact by being there. The other way we do it is by curbing the bushmeat trade. So a lot of the trackers and the porters, these guys walking behind me here, a lot of these guys used to be poachers. They've now been employed because they understand and they know the jungles as well as they do. And I've often seen the guides asking the porters, where do I go? What direction? Where? Because they know the forest better than the guides do. The guides get moved around a lot. And then lastly, or not lastly, but saving of forests and rewilding. It's about opening up space. So as their populations grow, that's fantastic. But there's only a finite amount of space. There's two little islands, Bundi Impenetrable National Park, and then I forgot to say Volcanoes National Park, which spans across 5 beautiful volcanoes, which are in 3 countries, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, and Rwanda. And what's happening now, lodges are actually going in and buying back farmland, this area here that you see in here, buying back these areas and reforesting them, allowing the gorillas to have more space to work with. But the most important part of this whole thing, and of conservation in general, definitely comes down to the people. It is about empowering people. It's about job creation. It's about showing them the value of these places. The hotels are employing people, porters to carry our stuff up, guides, and farmers to produce food for the hotels and things. And obviously along with it comes education. And I'm going to now let Matt educate you on rhinos.
So it's a, for anyone that's known me for more than about 30 seconds, I probably would have mentioned my love of rhinos to them, and it's actually the nicest thing I'm looking at in Rich's screen is the rhinos behind him. No offense, Rich. But rhinos being so gorillas, the one thing that made it incredible, well, not easy, but the probably the biggest difference between rhinos and then the mountain gorillas, because gorillas are split up into several species of gorillas, but the mountain gorillas in particular only occur in a very small area of these mountainous areas in Central Africa, whereas rhinos occur on 2 continents. So they are widespread across most of Africa, into Asia, and across into Southeast Asia. So they were 5 species spread across this massive tract of land, and each had their own story and have their own story to tell. And the least successful being the Sumatran and the Javan rhino. Unfortunately, there's very little success coming out of their story, because their habitats are being decimated at a rate that they don't know how much longer they're going to be able to hold on to. And a rainforest, much like the Amazon, the rainforest and the Lusa ecosystem has that minimal area of incursion. So in Madagascar, you can have pockets of rainforest that'll still survive, but the Amazon is I think the latest estimate is that it's about 10 or 15 years away from starting to lose, because it creates its own weather pattern, starting to lose its environmental impact, and it'll start becoming a savanna all on its own. Whereas Madagascar, it relies on coastal rainfall to give it its rainforest pattern. Central Africa, it relies on the whole continent. It doesn't create its own as much as the Amazon or the Lusa ecosystem. So the Javan and the Sumatran rhino, unfortunately not as successful as the greater one-horned, the black rhino, and the white rhino of Africa. So the greater one-horned rhino, their numbers have started to grow over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, and they're actually increasing. And the black rhino went from about 500,000 odd individuals at about turn of the 1900, 1905, dropped all the way down to the point where they were at about 2,000 in 1995. And slowly but surely, they've started to increase in numbers to they're just shy of 6,000 odd now. And those are scattered across most of Africa, or most of South and East Africa. If we take a look at the map there, you can see their geographic distribution. But then as humans started to, and this is the direct 100% cause of initially the great white hunters, as they called themselves, and colonization, of them coming over and shooting out dozens and dozens of these animals, to then moving into the exotic trade to fuel the market in the East. So rhino horn worth more than its weight in gold. But if you have a look at this distribution map, you can see where black rhinos, the 4 subspecies that occurred, there are now only 2 that remain. occurred across most of sort of sub-Saharan Africa with the exclusion of rainforest. So any savanna land, black rhinos or any mixed savanna land they used to occur on. And then now you can see where the circles represent the last pockets of them that were remnants from the historical distribution. And then with a project started by the WWF called the Black Rhino Range Expansion Project, those X's are where they are now occurring as well as other places. And so rhino conservation was more about, rather the gorillas was to conserve that little area, bring tourists in. Black rhinos now, because they're you've got to protect them so much from poaching, they are now taking them out of these areas that have bred them up to a population that is safe and stable and able to protect. Then they'll take that one out and move it and place it another one to allow that to start again. And so they're using and expanding these ranges, and they've expanded by about 750,000 acres in the last 20 years since the inception of that project about 20 years ago. But then the white rhino was another amazing success story that unfortunately in the last maybe 10 or 15 years, much like the incredible increase in meat consumption in China, the emerging upper middle class has also got a thirst for rhino horn, and it has changed and varies in what they use it for, whether it's ornamental, medicinal, etc., but they are the #1 consumer, is that growing Eastern middle class. And so we were able to, with the population of about 100 rhinos that was left in the Umfolozi Park, which is one of Africa's oldest parks, founded in 1895, we had a population of just over 100 rhinos. That was then the seed and the start of our entire southern white rhino population left in Africa. They were wiped entirely extinct across the entire continent. There were the northern white rhinos in South Sudan and into Uganda and northern Kenya. Those have gone extinct. But the southern white rhino, every white rhino that you see across the continent of Africa came from this remaining 100 rhino in the small park. And those were bred and moved and bred and moved. And so rhino conservation is a lot more moving parts. It's very, very different to a lot of other conservation stories. But if you look at it in a way that is so poignantly put by Sir David Attenborough, is that, and I'm not going to quote him verbatim, but is that if you were to save, basically to save a rhino is to save the environment in which rhinos survive, because neither of them are mutually exclusive. They depend on one another for their survival. So if you save a rhino, you have to save its environment. If you save its environment, you have to save a rhino. And being keystone species, everything else will rely on them. So they can be an ambassador, much like gorillas are, because if you save a gorilla, you're saving the habitat that they live in, because they rely on that habitat. And in doing so, you'll save everything else and us as a species. And that's kind of where towards the end of today we're going, is this topic of saving and preserving our wild areas. And what we've been talking about it at length, but what is the term that we've been calling it, Richard?
Rewilding.
It's so perfect.
Yes, absolutely. And the idea is sustainable use of everything. I think, the way we've got to look at it, Matt was talking about the fish stocks that were depleting. It's been worked out that if we conserve and make 1/3 of our coasts, only 1/3 of our coast non-fishing areas, we will have enough fish stocks to be able to feed ourselves indefinitely. And what we're doing in the world is a crazy thing. Matt used a 3-week scenario. I want to give another idea of what we're dealing with on our planet. Our combined weight as humans is about 300 million tons. The combined weight of our domestic animals is 700 million tons. And the weight of all the wild animals on top of that, 100 million tons. So we are domesticating the world. Only 30% of the animals left on this planet are wild. And that is a scary, scary fact. And Sir David Attenborough, to quote him again, because he is, between Matt and I, a great hero. He's done so much. I'm at 93. He's still the biggest ambassador for wildlife, I know. But he said 10,000 years ago, as hunter-gatherers, we lived a sustainable life because that was the only option. Today, we are faced with the same problem. We have to start living a sustainable life because we have no option. We need to change from being apart from nature to being a part of nature. Matt, do you have any final words?
I couldn't have put it better myself to end something on that note. The part and parcel of this 3-part series on Sapiens was based on the book, but a lot of it was also based on his most recent documentary and how this concept of rewilding, bringing nature into our lives and being a part of nature, don't be in these sterile environments that we have grown accustomed to, because the world will, if you take one thing, for example, look at what happened to that nuclear explosion in Chernobyl, how after 30 years, nature is starting to come back and is taking back over. No people can live there anymore. So the world will survive us, whether we like it or not. But it's a question of, well, why don't we want to survive? Why can't we then just look after nature so nature can look after us? As our ancestors did before we decided, no, let's throw out the rule book and let's do our own thing. And so, yeah, from my side, no, that was perfect, and thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah,
Sure.
We've got some good questions for you, and I just want to remind folks watching, if you guys have a question for Rich or Matt, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question. Can you just repeat really quickly the combined weights of humans, domestic, and wild animals?
So humans is 300 million tons. Domestic animals weigh in at 700 million tons, and wild animals at a mere 100 million tons.
Pretty amazing. Okay, the next question goes back to the photos you had of the Aral Sea. I think I'm saying that correctly. What year were the pictures taken?
These were all taken in the 2000s. So this is recent. This is a recent photo now of what this looks like. And this all happened in the 1960s. So this is all right about now. We're not even dealing with time that is long past. It was right at that time when everything was changing over. So 1930 to 1960 is when those channels were built. And then from 1960 to 2000 is when this all took place.
And might I just add something to that, is that we as a species, we pride ourselves on our incredible intellect. But this happened, what's that, 60 years ago, 50 years ago. Right now, we are doing exactly the same thing to an underground aquifer that I'm not going to try and pronounce the name, but it's sitting in the center of America. So basically it starts in Arkansas and it runs all the way down in between the Rockies and the Appalachian Mountains and kind of converges down into basically into the Mississippi. It's the extended Mississippi Delta there's an underground aquifer that is exactly the same thing is happening. And the estimate is that we might have another 50 or 60 years before this is what the center of America looks like.
Wow. Next question is about rhinos. If there are only 74 Javan rhinos, how can their population be rated as stable? It seems to be in peril.
So that they're in a very small pocket. So the only reason they're stable is because their environment is not changing. They are highly protected, highly guarded, and living in the last remaining habitat that they have left. So that's the only way they're stable. Their numbers are not increasing and their numbers are not decreasing.
Okay. Are either of you aware of any organized rewilding efforts occurring currently or planned for the immediate future?
I did mention in the gorillas that a few of the lodges are already starting to build up and open these things up. Matt and I were talking about another reserve in South Africa that was bought up that's like 500,000 acres that an investor bought into in order to create these things. So there's a lot of little projects. I don't know if you know any others, Matt.
Well, I mean, there's across a lot of South or Central America, there's a lot of reforestation that's going on. Madagascar, some of their national parks are expanding. One of the parks that we go to, Anjujavi, in collaboration with the WWF, they've increased their footprint by tenfold over the last 10 years to now encompass, it's about 20,000 acres. There's actually an incredible project that's ongoing and has been going on, where there is a wall of trees that's being built eastwards across the southern Sahara to reduce the encroachment of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert is encroaching by about a football length field a week southwards into Central Africa. And there's the forest. And I think they've planted about 10 million trees or so now to date over the last 20 years. That's going eastwards from the west coast of Africa. So there are a lot of projects going on. But you can do rewilding. I mean, even if it's not, if you're in a house or an apartment or something, it's literally having plants in your home where bees can come to. And instead of having a green lawn, have some lawn, but then have some wild flowers. Have just a little bit of nature in your own home.
Native species.
Yes, yeah, native species.
Great. What changes or efforts are being made with the people of Rwanda and Uganda so there's not so much pressure to expand farmland?
Well, I think as time goes on, the education part of it is a big step in the right direction. Your family sizes will hopefully get smaller because on average a Ugandan family has 8 children. It's between 6 and 8 children. So you can imagine the population explosion that goes along with that. And then there's delineation of the forest to ensure that there's no more encroachment going on, and to stop gorillas coming out and get that human-animal conflict going on where they might start eating bananas that people are growing. They've planted tea along the edges, which delineate the forest perfectly. It is then a cash crop, which can be used, and it's very high in tannins. So as soon as the gorillas get to it, they turn around and go back into the forest. So it's a great way of doing that side of things. But the only real way you can slow the movement forward is through education, and Rwanda has taken up a baton to try and educate their population with tech-savvy people. So to create something like a Silicon Valley there, which doesn't require deep resources, it requires mental resources rather than physical resources.
All right. And just one more question because we're getting close to the top of the hour. And since this is the final webinar in the Sapiens series for you guys, I thought it might be good to ask, what of all of the human developments you've discussed in the series is the one you think was most significant in the course of our history? And when you were reading the book *Sapiens*, what was the most surprising fact that you came across?
Matt, you start.
So the thing that I mean, I'd say the thing that gave us the ability to move was our ability to harness. Obviously, I mean, when everyone says, "Ah, caveman, we use fire," but I think that was it gave us the ability to move, being able to make fire a malleable resource that we could take from one place to another, because that gave us food in places we never had food before. It gave us the ability to shape our environment if we so chose to do it. It was an anti-predatory use. So that, I would say. But then in the book, it's to pinpoint one, I think I don't know, for me, it would possibly cheapen the experience of the book, because it is such an incredible piece of work. But that timeline in the very front of the book sets an amazing tone for it, and the way he moves and flows from one to the next without essentially pointing fingers, because that's the biggest thing now around the world, is that everyone is pointing fingers and saying they did it, they did it, they did it, they did it, and it's their responsibility to fix it. The only person that can change the world is yourself, and it's your everyday choice. And so relying on someone else, that's the biggest fault of the world, is relying on someone else to save it. And that's the message that I got from that book, is that he doesn't point any fingers at anyone. He just says it how it is.
My biggest wow out of the book was the domestication part, and how he explained how plants domesticated us, because they needed water, so we brought it water. It didn't like rocks, so we had to remove rocks. And there I was thinking that it was my previous thought was that being domesticated and having a beautiful house and everything was the pinnacle of our society. Meanwhile, it actually weakened us as a whole. But the biggest takeout for me is that everything, no matter which way we look at it, is heading towards unity. If we are to save our species, we have to be one, on one planet. We're on one little marble floating in the middle of nothing for the furthest distances around us. The only way we are going to fix this is together, not apart.
Great, thank you guys. Well, those were great closing comments, but I will still hand it back to you for closing comments, and we'll start with Matt.
Yes, thanks, Kendall, and thanks to everyone for coming. We had a bit of a timing issue at the beginning, so it is a bit later than our normal talks with your changing the clocks back. So that was Rich and my fault, no one else's. But it's been an absolute pleasure once again, and thanks to the WWF and NatHab. Thanks, Kendall, for hosting us as always, and thanks to my partner in crime for these fireside chats. It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks to you, Matt. I think Matt and I have lots of fun putting these things together, and we've both learned a hell of a lot. But it wouldn't have been possible without NatHab and WWF allowing us the time to get in front of you guys and chat, and Kendall for hosting us on these things. And I have learned a hell of a lot doing this whole Sapiens thing, and it's changed my view on things. And I think in this crazy time that we're going through in the world, a little bit of change will go a long, long way. So thanks for listening, guys, and back to you, Kendall.
Thank you, gentlemen. This was such an enlightening series. I'm so glad that you brought this to us, and thank you so much for staying up late to present with us. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye,
Good night, guys.